School Mind by Triads 101, the Essential Triad. Hi chicos and chicas, greetings from your science teacher, Mr. T, from your friendly JJ Center at Gardner Betts, Austin, ISD. I would like to take the opportunity to provide the kind viewer with the essentials of the Triad for purposes of getting the most out of the series School Mind by Triads 101. Let's start today's discussion by presenting the slide, the bare bones of the Triad. Our starting point, not surprisingly, is the complex Pythagorean theorem. By complex Pythagorean theorem, all we mean is that a complex expression is broken up into its imaginary part, which we plot on the vertical axis, and a real part, which we plot on the horizontal axis. If we take a close look at the essentials of the triad representation, we notice inside the right triangle the formulas that characterize the complex of I squared equals minus 1 and C squared equals A squared plus B squared. The first one, I squared equals minus 1, just tells us that we are here talking about complex numbers. We have placed, as customary, the imaginary on the vertical axis and denoted it with the lowercase I, with the real on the horizontal axis, though not have denoted it with a lowercase r, since it is understood. The familiar little square symbol at the intersection of the vertical and the horizontal axes is herein meant to signify that these don't touch, are orthogonal to each other, so to speak. Complex numbers are usually covered in your math algebra 2. Let's next go ahead and present what I consider to be the primeval Pythagorean theorem. The difference between the primeval and the regular one is that the primeval contains words as well as numbers, whereas the regular one contains numbers only. Our claim is that the primeval Pythagorean theorem, called Tetractys, has been dumbed down to our numbers only devoid of words version that is taught in our schools today. Let's take a look at the slide of the primeval Pythagorean theorem, Tetractys. The primeval Pythagorean theorem, called Tetractys, as we said, used the monad for the vertical, dyad for the horizontal, triad for the hypotenuse, and tetrad for the whole set up as one. Herein we have opted to use the more familiar words of spirit for the monad, vertical position, body for the dyad, horizontal position, mind for the triad, hypotenuse position, and deity for the absolute or God. From here onwards, the tetrad is understood, but we'll focus our attention on the triad. The interpretation of the complex plane within the triad paradigm is that we take the real to correspond to the body, all the while the imaginary to correspond to the spirit. By body, we understand the physical, what the senses can perceive, and by spirit, we understand the non-physical, what the senses cannot perceive. Pretty straightforward, I would say. The familiar little square symbol at the intersection of the vertical and the horizontal axes, as we said before, is herein meant to signify that these don't touch, that the physical and the spiritual are independent of each other in different spaces, or whatever you want to call it. In practice, this means that if the real is body and therefore visible, then necessarily the imaginary being spirit will be invisible. By invisible, we don't mean out of sight, but rather that the spiritual is of a different nature to the physical. The real will be a sensible body, which is to say that the senses can access it. By contrast, the senses do not have access to the spiritual. A doubt that immediately assaults one is, if body and spirit are orthogonal, then how do they communicate? This is where the coin analogy comes into play. Just like the ordinary coin has two sides that likewise don't touch, they are nevertheless both connected to the rim, which one could say that then the rim connects the opposite sides through its mediation, so to speak. By analogy, we could likewise say that while the body and spirit don't touch, they do both connect with the mind, such that by the intermediation of the mind, then body and spirit do connect. Now, before we go on with the second characteristic of C squared equals A squared plus B squared, suffice here to say that the hypotenuse comes to represent the mind. As such, the mind is composite of both body real and spirit imaginary, but not directly. And that this is so is evident from the fact that the complex has real and imaginary numbers that don't mix. But how does the body and the spirit connect by way of the mind will be the subject of the second characteristic that we'll see shortly. Now, regarding the second characteristic of C squared equals A squared plus B squared, we see that this is just the familiar definition of a right triangle, which states that the sum of the squares of the sides of a triangle is equal to the square of its hypotenuse. What's novel with the treatment of the right triangle within the Triads paradigm is that besides numbers, we use letters or words. The question that immediately comes to our mind regards the interpretation of the presence of words in the primeval Pythagorean theorem Tetractys. The question that the formula c squared equals a squared plus b squared addresses concerns the manner that body and spirit connect with each other by way of the mind. From complex number theory, we know that complex equals real plus I imaginary, plus the definition of the complex number is I squared equals minus 1. With a triad, what we do is to identify the complex with the mind, the real with the body, and the imaginary with the spirit. Let's take a quick look at the slide of the complex in the triad slide. The complex in the triad slide complex. This complex mind slide expresses the fact that the relationship is mathematically squared, meaning by this that it is second story as the elevation to the second power signals. That is, that the hypotenuse and the sides are not related at the ground level as c equals a plus b, but rather as c equals a plus ib, which would require a squaring relationship c squared equals c to the conjugate of c, wherein c is a minus ib. We'll omit the details, but if you do the math, you'll come up with the usual c squared equals a squared plus b squared. Lastly, we would like to take this opportunity to provide an added bonus to the series. It is often the case that scientists mention, like Isaac Newton, when accounting for his success in founding modern physics on mathematical principles. Then they were called natural philosophy, by the way. He is quoted as saying that he owed his success to having stood on the shoulders of giants, undoubtedly referring to the previous work done by on the subject by Kepler and Galileo, amongst others of similar stature. So then, let's provide the kind listener with a more graphic representation of the goings-on in science inquiry learning. It could very well be the case that the mind, so to speak, stands on the shoulders of the giants of the spirit and the body. Now that we've gotten this far, it is time to start addressing the content of the saying, standing on the shoulders of giants. But before we do this, we need to approach the subject matter with baby steps. If I ask you, if you were a bricklayer and you were laying two bricks side by side against the side of a wall, where would you then go about placing the third brick? This is a no-brainer, of course. Of course, you would place it in between both and immediately above, joined by the cement, and that kind of details. Needless to say. In the same tenor, if I were to ask you how you would get a better view of things if you were in the company of two giants, obviously the best view would be achieved standing on the shoulders of these two guys. Actually, you would need to do it, for if not, they would most likely step on you. And I don't mean step on your feet, I mean stepping on your head. Let's now, in closing, present to you a comprehensive slide which includes the I squared equals minus 1, the c squared equals a squared plus b squared, the body, mind, spirit, the bricklayer, and standing on the shoulders of giants. Of course, the image of standing on the shoulders of giants should be taken with caution, for the giant body is at the ground level, all the while the giant spirit, or the spirit giant, is at the sky level. This just goes to show that the mind combines in a unique manner the two qualities of body and spirit. While alive, of course, for when death supervenes, we all know that somehow the body goes back to dust, the spirit goes, for lack of a better word, away. As for the mind, that is also beyond my pay grade. To know where to it goes is so. I don't know. A caveat is in order here, so as to avoid possible misunderstandings. If all we did was to say that body and spirit don't touch, we would then be endorsing a dualism of sorts, in which body and spirit co-inhabit the world as if synchronized mode. That type of determinism may very well be, but this is not what we endorse. The problem with this type of determinism is that there will be no moral responsibility to our actions, given that the actions of living bodies would just happen to occur, as if on their own. What we do endorse is that by mediation of the mind, it is the case that the body couples with the spirit willingly. Well, that's all, chicos and chicas. Our hope is that you keep watching the other videos of the series School Mind by Triads 101.